Welcome to the debate. Today we're confronting what is arguably the most charged and enduring historical theory about the end of the Western Roman Empire, the fundamental role of religion. The collapse of the West was messy, of course. It involved barbarian incursions, political breakdown, and, well, profound economic turmoil that all culminated in that final loss of imperial control in 476 AD. But for centuries, historians have asked if the rise of a new religion was just a symptom of decline or if it actively fueled the internal rot.
And I think that's the key. The fall of Rome is, it's history's greatest detective story. But we have to be sure we're looking at the material evidence, not just the philosophical shifts. While the religious transformation of the 4th and 5th centuries was undeniable, the decisive blows against the Western Empire were material. They were external, geopolitical, and fiscal.
And that brings us right to our central question for today. Did the ascendancy of Christianity fundamentally undermine the civic, the ideological, and the military foundations of the Roman state, and in doing so cause its collapse? I'll be arguing that the shift in core Roman values, which was really catalyzed by Christianity, was the critical internal cause, replacing that civic will to survive with a transcendent focus.
And I'll argue that Christianity was actually a force of deep cultural transformation and, importantly, continuity. It preserved Roman civilization during this period we now call late antiquity. The true causes of the collapse were much older: systemic economic crises, demographic catastrophes, and just overwhelming military pressures that simply outpaced the state's capacity to respond.
Let's dig into that ideological cost then. My position really rests on the displacement of Romanitas, that traditional political, moral, and cultural identity that defined Rome from the Republic onward. Traditional Roman success was believed to be, guaranteed by the favor of the gods, and that was sustained by the mos maiorum, which we can roughly translate as the way of the ancestors.
The way of tradition.
Precisely. The state and the gods were inseparable. Early Christianity, however, was fundamentally subversive to this entire structure. It challenged the established world order, it promoted virtues like poverty and humility that were, frankly, antithetical to the aristocratic military ethos, and, I think most damagingly, it prioritized a transcendent divine power over earthly Roman power. I mean, why die for the emperor when the rewards are celestial? By the time the Western Empire finally dissolved, that focus on a shared nationality had been largely replaced by religious fervor. The Church, centered in Rome, became the most stable, powerful institution, effectively becoming the successor state, dictating morality and politics in a way the secular republic never would have tolerated.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the spiritual shift was the primary engine of destruction when the structural damage was, it was already terminal. The empire suffered decisive, near-fatal crises long before Constantine ever converted. We have to look at the hard material reality of the crisis of the 3rd century, running from, 235 to 284 AD?
A devastating period, certainly.
Rampant hyperinflation, massive currency debasement, where the silver content of the standard coin became almost non-existent, and just relentless internal political instability. We were cycling through emperors so fast that the political merry-go-round made it impossible to organize any kind of consistent defense of the borders. This fiscal weakness, this political disarray, it entirely predates the Christian ascendancy. The fatal blows were geopolitical, environmental, and demographic. The rise of sophisticated Germanic adversaries like the Goths and the Alemanni, who had grown wealthier and larger from their long interaction with Rome, that combines with catastrophic demographic shocks. I'm talking about diseases like the Cyprianic and Justinianic plagues. The mortality was so high that some historians suggest the epidemiological damage alone made the state ungovernable by just constantly depleting the tax base and the military recruitment pool. You just can't blame the Nicene Creed for mass death and hyperinflation.
That economic argument is undeniably strong, and I agree, the 3rd century crisis was absolutely devastating. But that material rot only became terminal when the state abandoned the philosophical tools it needed to fix it. Let's look at how ideology intersected with administration after Constantine. His embrace of Christianity coincided with crippling changes to the state's secular priorities. Just to fund the massive military that was required, the imperial government was forced to strip Western provincial towns of their regional tax income.
You're referring to the imposition of these unsustainable taxes, right? The Annona Militaris specifically?
Exactly, that dreaded mandatory tax used to supply the army. This centralization and this reduction of real regional income, it meant that the incentive for the local landowning elite, the literati, to spend their own time and money on local infrastructure, it just vanished. Why repair the roads or the aqueducts when the focus is entirely on Rome or Constantinople? So this elite, they shifted their attention away from provincial politics and local civic pride toward the imperial bureaucracies, just following the money and the power. This stripping of the provinces was a process concurrent with the religious shift, and it's a sign of the empire eating itself. Moving that intellectual focus away from provincial well-being to imperial survival at any ideological cost. It created an institutional dependency and a total lack of local resilience.
I see why you emphasize that institutional shift, but I would frame it very differently. The core institutional and fiscal problems you're describing, the need for massive centralized taxes, the decline of local infrastructure, those were direct consequences of the 3rd century collapse, not the 4th century conversion. Diocletian's tetrarchy and Constantine's founding of Nova Roma, or Constantinople, those were necessary administrative reforms responding to the sheer logistical impossibility of managing a collapsing, fragmented state. The bureaucracy grew monstrous because the task was impossible. It wasn't a religious choice, it was administrative triage.
But doesn't the religious shift provide the perfect intellectual justification for that kind of centralized bankruptcy?
Not necessarily. The real strain was the overwhelming loss of the high tax yield provinces like North Africa, the granary of the West. Due to relentless military threats and barbarian settlement, you lose your cash cow, you scramble for new revenue. The administrative complexity was a symptom of economic collapse and military pressure, independent of the theological debates swirling around Arianism or Nicene orthodoxy. The state just needed to survive, and it used every tool it had, including the newly powerful church, to try and stabilize its population. But the underlying reason for the instability was purely material. The borders were too long, and the treasury was empty. Let's look for a definitive metric of causality in the military realm. We should analyze the Visigothic sack of Rome in 410 AD. If Christianity was truly the source of this fatal institutional weakness, how do we explain the conduct of the invaders? The failure was primarily military and political, not religious, because the Goths, led by Alaric, were Christians themselves, specifically Arian Christians, and they explicitly showed religious restraint.
Restraint is an interesting word choice, I'll say that.
So he nominated the basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul as places of sanctuary. They avoided a general slaughter. They avoided wholesale enslavement within those sacred spaces. This action, which was recorded by Christian authors like Augustine and Orosius, it speaks volumes. It shows that even in its moment of violent success, the Goths operated within a recognizable, if different, cultural and moral framework that was provided by Christianity. What's more, the sack itself, while shocking, was less a successful final assault and more an admission of Gothic failure to secure land and recognition through negotiation. The real failure was a breakdown of diplomacy and military logistics on the part of the imperial government, not some crisis of faith.
That's a compelling argument about Gothic restraint and the specific nuances of Arian Christianity, but let's consider the practical implications of that. The very fact that Roman officials and the terrified populace had to rely on the moral restraint of their invaders, that proves the institutional weakness and the irreversible damage done to the state's military capability. Why couldn't the state defend its own capital? Because its legions were stretched thin, loyalties were fractured, and the tax base needed to pay the soldiers was gone. The failure to defend Rome against its Christian enemies is a profound military failure, and it was enabled by a deep internal distraction.
But the existence of restraint indicates continuity, not destruction.
It indicates a continuity of culture, yes, But the destruction of the state, regardless of the relative mildness of the 410 event compared to, say, the Vandal sack in 455, the external violence delivered the fatal economic blow. The long-term impact of those sacks resulted in the terminal economic paralysis of the Western Empire. It essentially ended aristocratic munificence. The wealthy just no longer had the resources or the confidence to fund public life. This material breakdown demonstrates that the internal weakness, ideological, military, and fiscal, is what enabled the external violence that was necessary to deliver the final collapse. And I have to push back on this idea that this was just a material failure. The ideological shift fundamentally compromised the state's legitimacy. We cannot minimize the deep conflict caused by the state's embrace and subsequent mandating of Nicene Christianity as the official state religion under Theodosius.
This meant the state was actively suppressing the traditional polytheistic religion that had been central to Roman identity and political legitimacy for centuries.
But was that identity truly cohesive by the 4th century?
It was cohesive enough to provide a foundational worldview. This was a massive shift in the source of divine favor and political authority. By destroying the core of traditional civic virtue, that belief that loyalty to the state guaranteed divine favor, right when the state needed mass loyalty most, this ideological unraveling contributed directly to the overall societal inability to rally and sustain itself against mounting material pressures. The state essentially told its citizens the old gods, the ones that had secured Rome for 1,000 years, were false. What spiritual authority was left for the emperor?
I agree the ideological shift was immense, but the idea of a single cohesive Romanitas was already deeply fluid well before Theodosius. We have to recall Caracalla's Antonine Declaration in 212 AD, which conferred citizenship on nearly all free residents of the empire. That move expanded the Roman identity to include all sorts of diverse provincial backgrounds. It was already adapting and evolving. Christianity merely adapted with it and became a new unifying facet of this evolving Roman identity.
It unified people in spite of the state, not for the state.
I think it did both. The Germanic groups migrating into the West were minorities who, rather than destroying the culture, fused with the existing Gallo-Romans, Ibero-Romans, and Italo-Romans. And how did they achieve this cultural stability? By using the church as the common adaptable cultural fabric. Far from subverting the culture, Christianity became the cultural constant among the new Western kingdoms. It preserved Roman traditions, literature, even elements of law and administration during that transition. I mean, look at the efforts of scholars like Cassiodorus. He was instrumental in making sure that classical texts were copied and maintained in monasteries after the infrastructure of the secular state had crumbled. Christianity stepped in to preserve what the collapsing state could no longer hold.
So to summarize my perspective, while we can't ignore the catastrophic material pressures, the Huns, the plagues, the fiscal ruin, these external shocks merely exploited a spiritual and institutional vulnerability. The shift away from the traditional, state-centered Romanitas toward a transcendent religious focus, it fundamentally compromised the core motivating principles and civic structures necessary to sustain a massive centralized empire. The Roman state lost its ideological heart, and that made the material shocks that followed fatal. It turned a crisis into a collapse.
The evidence, however, just points overwhelmingly to a failure of physical material infrastructure, a fiscal collapse rooted in the 3rd century crisis, chronic military overextension made worse by geopolitical shifts, and catastrophic demographic events like climate change and pandemics, which destabilized the state economically and demographically. Christianity was a profound and powerful element of late antiquity, of the whole period of transformation, but it was ultimately a beneficiary and a preserver of Roman cultural elements, not the primary engine of its destruction. The emperors failed because they ran out of money and men, not because the citizens stopped worshiping Jupiter.
I think the fall of Rome shows us something really important. It's a reminder that history's great shifts are always complex, and we always need multiple perspectives, ideology, infrastructure, material reality, to fully appreciate those interwoven causes.
Exactly. And it leaves us to weigh the importance of those spiritual motivations against the hard numbers of population loss and fiscal bankruptcy as we all continue to explore the depths of this incredibly complex transformation.